Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is James K. Polk, Part 3. We stopped last time during the Mexican War, and part of the war took place in California. In June 14th of 1846, Ezekiel Merritt and 32 Americans, private citizens, arrived in Sonoma, just north of San Francisco, California. And they took prisoner Mariano Vallejo, the Mexican commander there. And the California Republic flag was raised. It had a grizzly bear, and they declared the independence of California. These fellows decided were going to have their own country. So California had a period of independence. On July 4th, John C. Fremont was in Sonoma. Commodore John Sloat of the U.S. Navy took Monterey, California. And then he took Yerba Buena, also known as San Francisco. Fremont took San Diego, then Santa Barbara. So the American forces were winning against the Mexicans in California. On August 13th, Fremont and Robert Stockton took Los Angeles. November 23rd of 1846, Stephen Kearny and Kit Carson were en route to California at Gila, at the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers. And they received news that the Mexicans had taken back Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and San Diego. And then Stockton retook San Diego. It was wide open war in California. Kearny arrived in San Diego with 100 troops. Eventually in December, he was 60 miles from San Diego. There was a fierce battle fought between the U.S. military and the Mexicans. And then he arrived in San Diego and took San Diego. Kearny was wounded and recovering there. Then Los Angeles was recaptured in January of 1847 after battles at San Gabriel and La Mesa. By January 14th, Fremont was in Los Angeles, and there was conflict between Stockton and Kearny. This often happens. Stockton sailed to Mazatlan in Mexico, and Fremont was appointed governor of California. Now, in this conflict between John C. Fremont and Stephen Kearny, it was deemed, or some believed, Fremont was guilty of military insubordination. By May of 1847, Kit Carson was in Washington City, and Fremont was arrested. Now, his father-in-law was a powerful man, Thomas Hart Benton, also known as Old Bullion, and he worked to have his son-in-law cleared. By this time, it was late September of 1847. President Polk was very sick into early October. By November, the trial of John C. Fremont took place at the Washington Arsenal, and he was found guilty of insubordination. Years later, he was the Republican Party nominee for president. Fremont resigned from the Army, and Thomas Hart Benton was very upset with President Polk. Now, in 1847, there was growing anti-Mexican War sentiment. Abraham Lincoln was a newly elected congressman. He was against the war. And Lincoln challenged President Polk to, quote, establish whether the particular spot on which the blood of our citizens was shed was or was not at that time our own soil. General Scott and, now back in Mexico City, General Scott and Nicholas Trist became friends. General Franklin Pierce, who became president later, he commanded 2,400 soldiers in the U.S. Army in Mexico, and this was toward the end of the war. General Winfield Scott was driving toward Mexico City with 14,000 troops. The Mexican General Santa Anna had 25,000 troops. And Scott was following in the footsteps of Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conqueror of Mexico. On September 8th, 1847, the Battle of Chapultepec was fought and won by the U.S. military. And this is where that battle led to a reference in the Marine Corps hymn, From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battles on the land and on the sea. So the Halls of Montezuma refers to, Montezuma was the Aztec king when the Spanish conquered Mexico in the 1500s. And so the Halls of Montezuma refers to the Battle of Chapultepec and the contribution of the U.S. Marines on September 8th, 1847. So on the drive toward Mexico City, Robert E. Lee was a part of the U.S. forces. On August 20th, the Americans were at the gates of Mexico City, pushing the Mexican army back. And by September 14th, General Winfield Scott and the U.S. Army rode into the city square, the capital of Mexico, and Mexico City fell to the U.S. military. Gideon Pillow, who was another general, bragged that he was the big hero. He called himself the hero of Chapultepec. And this led to a conflict with Winfield Scott, arguing who was the hero. And Pillow was arrested November 22nd. President Polk said, quote, "A most embarrassing state of things exists in the Army, all produced by General Scott's bad temper, dictatorial spirit, and extreme jealousy, lest any other general officer should acquire more fame in the Army than himself." So President Polk supported Gideon Pillow in this conflict with Winfield Scott. Now, the Mexicans expected to be bribed for a peace settlement. Santa Anna was paid $10,000 by General Winfield Scott to help cause a peace settlement. Now, one of the things the Americans wanted was a rite of passage across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. An isthmus is an area of land in which the land narrows between two bodies of water, in this case, the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. And the U.S. was interested in having a passage across this isthmus so that for trade. But the Mexicans wouldn't go for it. There was slow negotiations during the U.S. occupation of Mexico City. President Polk said, quote, "If Mexico continued obstinately to refuse to treat, I was decidedly in favor of insisting on the acquisition of more territory." The American negotiator Nicholas Trist was not doing a good job, and he retreated on the Rio Grande border. And, the Mexicans wanted it pushed back to the Nueces River. And Trist apparently agreed. President Polk said, quote, "Mr. Trist has managed the negotiations very bunglingly and with no ability." So President Polk sent a message that Trist was being recalled and relieved of his duties. However, Trist refused to leave. And by January 4th of 1848, President Polk heard the rumor that Trist was still in Mexico City. And President Polk said, quote, "He may, I fear, greatly embarrass the government." Now, by this time, Winfield Scott had been replaced as the American general in Mexico City by General William Butler, who was given diplomatic power to conclude a treaty. However, Nicholas Trist continued to negotiate, and on February 2nd, Trist concluded a treaty with the Mexican authorities signed near Guadalupe Hidalgo. And according to the conditions, the border was the Rio Grande River between the U.S. and Mexico, the Rio Grande from the Gulf of Mexico to El Paso, and then also New Mexico and Upper California would come to the U.S., and then the U.S. would pay the Mexicans $15 million. This was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. The United States received 500,000 square miles of Mexican territory. And again, the Rio Grande became the border. The U.S. paid the Mexicans $15 million. Now, the cost of the war for the U.S. was $100 million. 12,000 U.S. soldiers died in the war, many of disease. Again, Ulysses S. Grant, future Civil War hero and president, he was there. This was the biggest addition since the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession. Historian Daniel Walker Howe wrote, quote, "The conquest of Mexico by the small armed forces of the United States, despite formidable geographical difficulties and in the face of a hostile population, constituted one of the most amazing military achievements of the 19th century." The Mexicans didn't want to give this right of transit through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Now, the treaty arrived in Washington February 19th. President Polk was in favor of it. His Secretary of State, James Buchanan, opposed it. He said he wanted more land in Mexico. However, the treaty was sent to the Senate for advice and consent. That same day, former President John Quincy Adams died in the Senate. He died right there. He died with his boots on. Now, President Polk said, quote, "If the treaty in its present form is ratified, there will be added to the United States an immense empire of the value of which 20 years hence it would be difficult to calculate. And yet Democratic and Whig senators disregard this and act solely with the view to the elevation of themselves or their favorites to the presidential office." Some of the opposition in the Senate, they said, that the U.S. got too much or they got too little. Finally, on March 10th, the Senate ratified the treaty. Nathan Clifford was sent to Mexico with the amended treaty, and he arrived on April 11th. On May 22nd, the Mexican Congress ratified the new treaty. The Gila River was the southern boundary of Arizona. Now, 5 years later, in 1853, James Gadsden was sent to Mexico to purchase the land south of the Gila River for a railroad line. The United States bought the Mesilla Valley south of New Mexico and Arizona for $10 million, and actually completed the map of the continental United States. Now, the treaty did include, finally, a right of transit across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the right to build a plank road and a railroad, but the U.S. never did that. Instead, they decided to build a railroad at the Isthmus of Panama and then build a canal there years later. So, the Mexican War was fought and won by the United States. July of 1848, President Polk said, quote, "The results of the war with Mexico have given to the United States a national character abroad, which our country never before enjoyed." Major accomplishment. January of 1848, gold was discovered near Sacramento, California, which led to the gold rush of 1849, after which the San Francisco 49ers of the NFL are named, who recently played in the Super Bowl. 100,000 treasure seekers arrived in California, hoping to strike it rich in 1849. Also in 1848, the first gas lights were installed at the White House. However, early on, the gas company closed the plant at 9 p.m. The White House had a reception, and all of a sudden, all the lights went out because the gas company turned off the power. And they only had one candle that was lit. Now, also, during this time, thousands of American settlers were coming to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And again, the border between the United States and Canada had been set at 49 degrees latitude. On the Canadian side, the Canadian provinces in that area included British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. On the American side, Washington State, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. In May of 1848, Wisconsin was admitted as the 30th state, a free state. In July of 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott held a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and they were pushing for women's suffrage, for the right to vote for women, which they did not have at that time and would not have until 1920. May of 1848, the Democratic Convention was in Baltimore. It was a presidential election year, and President Polk was not running for re-election. One term was enough. He was really tired. He had no time for leisure. And President Polk said this, quote, "The public have no idea of the constant accumulation of business requiring the president's attention. No president who performs his duty faithfully and conscientiously can have any leisure. If he entrusts the details and smaller matters to subordinates, constant errors will occur." President Polk was the first president to refuse to run for a second term. He favored no candidate, and Lewis Cass was the front-runner for the Democratic nomination, and Cass was nominated. Now, in June, the Whigs held their convention in Philadelphia, and Abraham Lincoln was a delegate. Zachary Taylor, who was the major military hero in the Mexican War, was the front-runner. Henry Clay ran again at age 71. John Tyler said that Clay was, quote, as old as his gait indicates. Can it be that he looks to 48? Is the fire of ambition never to be extinguished? Zachary Taylor won the nomination. Clay finished second, and Winfield Scott third. Charles Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams, was a delegate. He opposed Zachary Taylor and walked out of the convention because Taylor owned slaves. So, now when the election was held in November, the Mexican War hero Zachary Taylor won and was elected the 12th president in November of 1848. In the final months of President Polk's administration, he offered to buy Cuba from Spain for $100 million, but the Spanish declined. He was very sick in June of 48. He traveled to Bedford Springs, Pennsylvania for a recovery, and the spring water there helped with his digestion. November 2nd of 48 was President Polk's 53rd birthday, and he said this, quote, upon each recurrence of my birthday, I am solemnly impressed with the vanity and emptiness of worldly honors and enjoyments, and of the wisdom of preparing for a future estate. December 5th, he gave his last State of the Union address, quote, and he said, quote, peace, plenty, and contentment reign throughout our borders, and our beloved country presents a sublime moral spectacle to the world. In reviewing the great events of the past year and contrasting the agitated and disturbed state of other countries with our own tranquil and happy condition, we may congratulate ourselves that we are the most favored people on the face of the earth. While the people of other countries are struggling to establish free institutions under which man may govern himself, we are in the actual enjoyment of them, a rich inheritance from our fathers. While enlightened nations of Europe are convulsed and distracted by civil war or intestine strife, we settle all our political controversies by the peaceful exercise of the rights of freemen at the ballot box. Within less than 4 years, the annexation of Texas to the Union has been consummated. All conflicting title to the Oregon Territory south of the 49th degree of north latitude, being all that was insisted on by any of my predecessors, has been adjusted, and New Mexico and Upper California have been acquired by treaty. The territories recently acquired and over which our exclusive jurisdiction and dominion have been extended constitute a country more than half as large as all that which was held by the United States before their acquisition, and including Oregon, nearly as great an extent of territory as the whole of Europe, Russia only excepted. The Mississippi River, so lately the frontier of our country, is now only its center. So the country had doubled in size during Polk's time in the White House. He continued, President Polk said, quote, I put my face alike against Southern agitators and Northern fanatics, and should do everything in my power to allay excitement by adjusting the question of slavery and preserving the Union. Of course, slavery was a growing issue of conflict, and which was eventually would lead to the Civil War. Now, President Polk said, quote, Mr. Buchanan, his Secretary of State James Buchanan, Mr. Buchanan is an able man, but is in small matters without judgment, and sometimes acts like an old maid. During the final months of his presidency, President Polk purchased a home in Nashville, which he named Polk Place, which he intended for his retirement. March 3rd of 1849, the U.S. Department of Interior absorbed and combined with the General Land Office, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Pension Office, Bureau of Census, and Patent Office. March 4th was the end of his term, President Polk's term, and the Stars and Stripes was flying from San Diego Bay to Puget Sound in the Seattle, Washington area. So March of 1849, Zachary Taylor was inaugurated as the 12th U.S. president. And James K. Polk returned to Tennessee, his home in Tennessee, in a roundabout tour of the Deep South. Decided to see the country. He received boisterous welcomes and grand banquets. It's kind of unfortunate. He really needed to rest, but he took this trip. A Potomac cruise to a railroad connection on the Virginia shore, past Fredericksburg, Richmond, Petersburg, and Wilmington, North Carolina, a steamship to Charleston, South Carolina, a steamboat to Savannah, Georgia, railroad to Macon, Georgia, a stagecoach to Columbus, Georgia, and a railroad to Montgomery, Alabama. By that time, he was real sick. He took a steamboat down the Alabama River to Mobile, and on that ship, a passenger had died of cholera. It's believed that Polk contracted cholera at that time. He sailed on to New Orleans and took a steamboat to Nashville, Tennessee. Along the way, he passed Baton Rouge, Natchez, and Vicksburg, Mississippi. He was real sick. In Memphis, and he stopped in Memphis. He made a stop in Smithland, Kentucky. April 2nd, he arrived in Nashville by steamer on the Cumberland River and visited his mother in Columbia, Tennessee. Then they visited his wife Sarah's family in Murfreesboro. And finally, he arrived home. Polk Place was not finished. He came home to the unfinished Polk Place. By June 2nd, he was very, very sick, and he died on June 15th, 1849. His ex-presidency, 103 days, was the shortest in history. His funeral was held at McKendree Methodist Church in Nashville. Near the end of his presidency, President Polk had said, quote, "I am sure I shall be a happier man in my retirement than I have been during the 4 years I have filled the highest office in the gift of the people." Again, he'd purchased this home called Polk Place, and he's only there a short time before he died. His final words were, quote, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you," talking to his wife. And his widow, Sarah, lived at Polk Place for 42 more years. Former President Polk died June 15th, 1849, in Nashville, Tennessee, at age 53 of what's believed to be cholera. James Buchanan, his Secretary of State, said, quote, "He was the most laborious man I have ever known, and in the brief period of 4 years had assumed the appearance of an old man." Now, Polk was initially buried at his home cemetery at his home, but in 1893 he was entombed on the grounds of the state capitol in Nashville, Tennessee. James K. Polk increased the size of the United States by 38%. Sarah was a powerful and influential first lady, and she had the longest widowhood of any first lady, 42 years. Polk Place was a neutral ground during the Civil War. Former President Polk was respected as a Southerner and a Unionist. During the Civil War, Sarah hosted dinners for both Confederate and Union leaders. She remained neutral in the war. Folks believe she was considered to have dark skin, and her nickname was Sahara Sarah. Sarah died in 1891 at age 87. Now, at the Tennessee State Capitol, of the East Steps, there's an equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson facing James K. Polk's tomb. Historian Walter R. Borneman wrote, quote, "Old Hickory's boy had done him proud." Paul R. Bergeron wrote, quote, "Virtually everyone remembers James K. Polk and his expansionist successes. He produced a new map of the United States which fulfilled a continent-wide vision." Historian Robert W. Mary wrote, quote, "To look at the map of the continental United States and to take in the western and southwestern expanse included in it is to see the magnitude of James K. Polk's presidential accomplishments." Historian George Bancroft wrote about James K. Polk, quote, "He was prudent, far-sighted, one of the very best and most honest and most successful presidents the country ever had." For these 3 videos, I read a tremendous biography. The title is Polk, the Man Who Transformed the Presidency and America, by Walter R. Borneman, 2008. So in conclusion, James K. Polk is really an American history who deserves to be remembered for his efforts in securing and negotiating with Great Britain and finalizing the border with the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel, and prosecuting successfully the the war with Mexico, the Mexican War, in which the entire Southwest was brought into the U.S., including Texas, securing Texas and bringing in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and parts of other states. What a tremendous accomplishment of the life of James K. Polk. And he worked. He gave everything he had to the presidency, and he died 3 months after leaving office, in large part due to the tremendous work that he'd done. And the map of the United States that we have today is in large part, at least the western part, due to his efforts. God bless James K. Polk, a man who served his country well. Well, that concludes today's episode. I hope you have a good history book to read or find one. There's so many amazing history books that have been written and are available. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 592 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. You also might consider checking out our podcast, Adventures in History. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.